Well, welcome. So excited to be here this afternoon. Myself, as well as these lovely four panelists. We've spent a considerable amount of time, I guess, over the last month and a half or so, connecting with each other, learning more about who each other is, and then specifically curating a conversation to really get to the heart of this particular conversation. So this particular panel is called Leadership in the New Economy. My name is Brianna Sylver. I am an alum of ID, so I have design training both at the undergrad and graduate level. Today, I work in a variety of different organizational contexts, from small to large, as well as nonprofit to for-profit. But definitely am in the position of helping to influence change on a frequent basis, but come from it from a very different perspective than these individuals here. And I want to take a little bit of just a moment to share kind of the context of this, and then I'll have each of these individuals share more about themselves. So the focus of the panel. This particular panel was brought together by Andre because the world is changing. So the world as we know it is changing. It's forcing us to look at how can we create sustainable futures that we've kind of gotten to the point where it no longer can operate the way that it is. But this is a perspective that's not a wish anymore, but really sort of a must-have, and generally a lack of understanding around how to operate in that must-have environment. But one thing that happens is that when change occurs, it really evokes what I call the monster of fear with it. And as soon as that fear is evoked or sparked, what you start dealing with is not the things that are actually face value, but all the psychological and political dynamics that are underneath that. And as Randy shared in one of our previous conversations, you really start to stoke all the values that are based in that system, and then the fear for all the losses of what need to be given up. And that means that you're dealing with change on two different levels. You're dealing with sort of the content or the container of change, which I think is where design typically operates. And then you're also dealing with navigating the personal dynamics around fear, which is really where all of these folks are experts. And so each of these individuals have been chosen intentionally to be part of this panel by Andre, and they've each been chosen because they have demonstrated in their work history that they have recognized that in the context that they work, that the current economy is not sustainable, and they have demonstrated how they are able to help navigate others towards a different future. And so with that, I also want to kind of introduce this aspect of adaptive leadership, because that is really, all of these individuals are experts in their own right in adaptive leadership. And being that design is sort of my homegrown territory, as many in the room, I wasn't that familiar with that term. I recognize that there's a lot of things associated with it that I do on a professional basis, but the theories and the concepts underneath that were new to me. So I'm going to just spend like 30 seconds giving you the highlight and then turn it over to these folks to share more. So there's sort of two key principles that are really at the forefront of adaptive leadership, and two that are really going to be the focus of this particular panel. So the first is that leadership is available to anyone irrespective of position. So it's about taking leadership out from being a position of authority and really democratizing it and making it available to everyone around you. And in that process, there's different dynamics that need to be at play, as well as aspects of inspiration and empowerment that need to be evoked. So that's the first principle. The second is that adaptive work is unsettling, and so this is, harkens back to the aspect that everybody wants to transform, but nobody wants to change. And so when people are in the position of needing to change and needing to transform, there's an aspect of disequilibrium that needs to be sustained, and some aspect of certainty that needs to be given to people, or sort of comfort in that process. So how do you get people to the point of being comfortably uncomfortable, if you will, and yet still mobilized for change and action? So we're here today to really explore how each of these panelists have evoked these principles in their work. And I would like to just go down the line and have each person introduce themselves. I'm looking for your name, your organization that you're involved with, and what's sort of the one core tension point that has really, in your professional career, gotten you to the point of being quote unquote experts of adaptive leadership here? So Sarah, why don't you start? Oh, we don't have mics. All right, Randy, why don't you start? Okay.
Okay. Hello? Can you?
Yeah.
Okay, great. My name is Sarah Coulter. I'm the executive director of an organization called the Calumet Collaborative, which is a nonprofit organization that works through collective action to transform the Calumet region. And I think one of the tension points for me in my career and through this organization is that there's a whole lot to do and a lot of people doing really great work, but how do we take that really great work and make a bigger impact? And so figuring out how to do that and make the bigger impact in an area, in a region that really needs it the most and deserves it the most and has so many assets, how do we do that as a group?
Great, thank you.
Just double checking because I can listen to you, but I'm right next to you. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Marco Ugarte. I'm part of Antea Group. Antea Group is an engineering and sustainability consulting outfit. And prior to that, I spent a few years in the corporate world managing sustainability for Miller Coors on the brewing industry. So piggybacking your insight, any professional in the corporate or the operational aspect of sustainability, the first rule of that space is that you need to lead by influence. Except for a few big global organizations with literally an army behind them or supporting them, most of the corporate sustainability teams tend to be a handful of people in charge of global goals, in charge of global teams across the company. So leading by influence, not by rank or fear or any other medieval method, it's the first rule. And I think that's the complexity that we all need to navigate over time. How do you make yourself available, or how do you make all this complexity tractable and digestible across the business or across the communities where you operate?
That's great, thank you, Marco. I think you guys can keep that because we've got another one over here.
Hi, I'm Sharon Bush. I'm the Executive Director of Grand Victoria Foundation. We are a grant-making organization that awards up to $9 million a year to organizations across the state that work to improve local economies, local education systems, to think about inclusive and sustainable land and water conservation, and to figure out ways to increase and enhance civic participation and civic engagement around the state. The thing that probably brings me here in terms of attention or a problem to address is I think that I've been in philanthropy for about 14 years now, and I think despite kind of our good intention as a sector, that we actually can exacerbate inequity. And so how do we think about redesigning like what we do in order to figure out how to be in a new world?
That's wonderful, thanks, Sharon.
My name's Randy Stark. Good afternoon. I'm the Executive Director of the National Association of Conservation Law Enforcement Chiefs, and that's a national organization that's made up of the law enforcement executives from the state agencies nationally. And our purpose is to, among other things, is to create a stream of leadership that understands the future as it's going to be tomorrow, not like it was yesterday. And the tension that brings me here, I'll take a little different tack perhaps, is just if I roll you back to about 1840, there were 30 million buffalo in this country. And if you just fast forward to about 1884, there was 20 left. So in that short window of time when the railroads went west and improvement in rifle technology and ability to make leather out of buffalo hides, all of the changes took place. For the first time in this country, we really came to grips with the fact that our natural resources are not inexhaustible. And in the wake of that, a number of people, Theodore Roosevelt, George Bernard Grinnell, created a conservation infrastructure in this country that's worked well for 150 years. The problem is, like most challenges, the solution of something back there creates the new challenge for you today. And that's what brings me here, is that our system of conservation in the country, while it's worked well in the past, we're encountering significant new realities. And the way that we've done business in the past is just no longer going to be effective. And that concerns me very deeply, because I could ask all of you in here, you know, to name one thing that you care about that's in here, or in your life, that isn't ultimately a subsidiary of the natural world. And I could lay a steak dinner out for you if you want to come up with something and it holds all the way through tomorrow. I'm pretty confident I won't have to buy one. And so my point of being here is that the work of changing a system that has worked, and then to get it to adapt to new realities. I learned this the hard way as a chief executive, where the limits of formal authority, you come up against them immediately. That there's no memo I could write to people to fix this problem by next Tuesday at 4:30 and report back to me. That this was a deeper learning that the system had to do, and so this confronting this reality and being in a position of formal authority and recognizing the limits of that are what brought me here and have really helped me operate differently for addressing adaptive work.
That's great. Thank you, Randy. It was a good segue, too, because what we really want to dive into is that first principle of adaptive leadership that I mentioned, which is the fact that everybody can be a leader irrespective of position. And so, like Randy was just setting up for us here, you know, you may not be in a position to have the authority to say change it and change it by Tuesday, but you do have the ability to be an influencer of change in some pace. And I think the pace changes depending upon the organization and what's happening. But this whole section, and I'm going to ask for specific stories from each of our panelists, but this is about how do you democratize leadership? How do you disentangle it from that position of authority and really empower people to be the change? And you know, one of the things that I always love is this aspect that change isn't happening to you, it's happening for you and from within you. And so when you're being called to change, you're being called to change for a purpose. And I think one of the things that I love about this principle of adaptive leadership is it's really asking people to define how they can be part of that change and inspiring them to do that. And so specifically, just very fortuitously, I guess we all just sat on this side. I would like to actually ask both Randy and Sharon to share some perspectives. So one of the things that Randy has done is he has helped to create a National Leadership Academy, really focused to his conservation effort that he was starting. And so, Randy, can you share a little bit about, you know, how you have really proactively changed the model of engagement around this?
I can tell you how we're trying to make progress on doing it.
That sounds great.
Essentially, we viewed this National Leadership Academy as an intervention into the system. And so we tried to structure in such a way that it was a national academy. So we had representatives from every state that came, because ultimately on the output end is we want a network of people that we're going to put on the landscape. So bringing in people from all different states. And then what we ultimately wanted people to do is to have this capacity to see situations differently and to exercise leadership differently, and to be able to mobilize a network in service of a collective purpose. And so we used the adaptive leadership model, systems thinking, and recently integrated design thinking into the academy curriculum. And our goal is to get this group to take on some of these larger scale institutional challenges that we face in conservation work. To take and deploy the learning that they've generated together, the collective learning, and then create a network, a nationwide network, to nationally go after these challenges at a localized level. And so that's kind of what we're trying to do, and using the adaptive leadership systems thinking and design, and then have people go out and actually have a live encounter with doing the work in a 4-month period to begin to have live encounters with doing adaptive work, and then coming back for a 3rd week to reflect on the experiences that they've had. Ultimately, what we want to try to do is mobilize this network, and this is the piece that, to be honest with you, we struggle with, is that we can get people to understand adaptive leadership. We can get them to understand, systems, a way to look at things. But to mobilize a network out there to actually, engage and do the work, the systemic forces are very strong out there. People get kind of sucked back in a whirlwind of activity, and so this is the next frontier for us, is how do we now mobilize that network that we've created some capacity in, and using design has been kind of a start to that, and we're very happy with the initial results we've had with that, and now we can see some new possibilities. But at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is bring people in that are in the mid-level of the organization, that have some authority but not the authority. They have the capacity to convene people on local levels and begin to try to exercise leadership and mobilize with other people to take these challenges on. That's kind of our methodology.
I just have a follow-up question, because I don't think we've ever actually talked about this piece of it. When you're developing the interventions in the Leadership Academy, is everybody tackling the same intervention in a localized way or separate?
Yeah, that's a great question. When we first started, when we brought people in to do the academy, we had them come with with an adaptive challenge from their agency that was more individualized. And that was useful in terms of teaching them the principles of adaptive leadership and how to kind of diagnose a situation and come up with intervention options. But we weren't getting at those bigger institutional challenges, so we couldn't start to move that bigger needle. And that's what got us to design, is that we tried, this is the first year we shifted from those individualized to a larger institutional. And we created the design around surfacing what those institutional challenges are, surfacing what the adaptive work for the agencies were in those challenges, what their personal adaptive work was. You'll hear it, I didn't sign on to do this, right? So there was personal adaptive work. And then figuring out what kind of a new future do we all want? What are the innovation spaces to create that? And who needs to be involved? What are the different partners that we haven't engaged before? So this is it's a very great question, because this is the pivot that we made with design to try to get at the larger institutional pieces.
And to really get the impact that you're looking
Yes.
for. That's great. Awesome. Well, Sharon, I'd love for you to talk a little bit now about your process. So I know that for you, you've done a lot of work in terms of how to have people bring their whole self to their work, both in terms of people that you're granting money to, as well as your own internal staff. So can you talk about, basically some of the impacts around that model of engagement that you've seen?
Sure, and maybe just to give a little bit of context is I just became the executive director about 1.5 years ago, and I'm following behind a founding executive director who was at the foundation for 20 years. So there's a lot about me as a person that I bring into the role that is very different from our previous leader, and a lot of what has been my lived experience, both personally and professionally, really does inform kind of how I think about this. So we're a foundation. We've always been about systems change, kind of implicitly, explicitly, and we just are, right? And so we're figuring out how to say that really boldly, really explicitly, very directly. I was in a previous breakout session, and I would define systems change in the same way that was talked about, which is really thinking about how to change conditions that persistently hold problems in place, right? So in my opinion, or based on like my experience, what I think often happens is that we don't adequately incorporate, or even when we do, we don't actually respect really the voices of those who are affected by dysfunctional systems, or those who might substantially benefit, like if the conditions were better. And so we have been asking this question of ourselves for some years before I became the leader, of like, how do we think about like, how are people impacted by our grantees' work? And how do we think about putting people back at the center of what that looks like? So this notion of like bringing your whole self, right, in terms of what folks out in the external world can and should do in terms of informing decisions. And then like we had to like look at that ourselves. So over the past year, like what we've done is we've shifted our grant making focus to really put people and community at the center of the things that we want to support. So that really helps us think more deliberately about the human dimension to the work, like in terms of like what you presented around the adaptive leadership model. And then for us, like in terms of a philanthropic organization, it actually allows us to demonstrate our trust, that community-driven problem solving, that we trust that communities can do that in ways that I think foundations often don't do, in the way we do due diligence processes and all these other things, in the way we practice, that can actually breed mistrust. So like all of this is new for us.
Sure.
And so we actually recently just rolled out our new strategy a month ago. So we're going to be funding things like a lot of things that we've been talking about all day today, which is like how to support leadership development, like at all levels, not leadership as authority, so not just chief executives, but at all levels of within organizations and outside. How to help people think about or encourage them to take collective action when that's necessary. So coordination, collaboration, collective action. How to give people flexible capital to think about innovation, so that if what needs to happen is that if problems are persistently held in place, and that requires some disruption, that probably requires some innovation, and how can people get the capital in order to do that? And then how do we get people to be engaged, like really engaged, and make that engagement be inclusive, so that like people who are in communities have some agency and voice over how public resources get allocated, distributed, so that people can use that as a way to make sure that the communities that they live in come to be in the way that they want to see. So like we've mostly been affected internally by this, is the impact that we've seen, and that like we've had to restructure ourselves in these ways. That was one of the ways, is kind of like talking about what we want to do and see externally. But I've rearranged the staff. I'm looking for different experiences in the people who are the frontline staff who engage with community to do the work and to do grant making and work in partnership with people. We have made explicit like what some of our values are around what does it mean for us to practice philanthropy in this way. How does that affect our internal communications with each other as a team, and how does that then also affect how we communicate with each other outside? We're a small team, but we've dismantled hierarchy in a way so that we can really figure out how to be our own different kinds of leaders inside, so that we can be modeling internally what we want to see in the world. So we've made a lot of internal changes so that we can make sure that like we are very well equipped to engage in a particular way that allows us to be good partners and lift up work that is really truly community driven.
That's wonderful. And what I take away from the two of you speaking is, you know, when you think back to this leadership principle number one, in the sense of making leadership available and accessible to everyone, I think a big piece of it is giving voice to everyone, but also setting collective intentions so that people know kind of the boundaries. So, you know, particularly, I think this is relevant, you know, in your context, Randy, yours as well, Sharon, but where this may not even be, in the case of Randy, like the passion project of the person coming to the Leadership Academy. It's probably not, right? But yet we're still expecting them to have influence and impact on that. And so setting those collective intentions so that everybody knows the boundaries of where that can be. And then goes back to one of my favorite principles, and one that has, like, honestly, I think probably opened up for me to be the professional that I am. And it's my first boss who ever said, my first day of work, I do not want you to ask for permission. The mantra here is beg for forgiveness, don't ask for permission. But I think there's a piece of that with that collective set of intentions, you kind of know the boundaries of where and how to act. And when you don't looking for that permission, you can really be empowered to do so. So now I want to take a spin and kind of go to our second principle of leadership, adaptive leadership. And that is the fact that this adaptive work, it's pretty unsettling. People don't really love change. They don't love to experience change. They love the idea of change, if you will. So, and that when you're in the state of change, people really need to be held in that space of disequilibrium, and that as the leader of this adaptive work, or a piece of it, it is your responsibility to help them to be held in that space. And so kind of coming back to the point that I started the conversation about, in the sense that when you're in that moment of change, you're having to make visible the values and the loyalties that are part of that system. So I think this is certainly a principle that is held both within the adaptive leadership realm, obviously, but then even also within design, in the sense of who are all the stakeholders as part of our map. And particularly when you start talking about government and nonprofit work, you're talking about stakeholders who aren't even your users. They could be even far, far, far from your users, but there's somebody who holds a position of influence within that. So what are those values that are at play? What are the loyalties at play? And then most importantly, what are the losses that need to occur for the system to change? And then how does that disrupt those values and loyalties? And kind of where do you need to be paying attention to that? So, and I really want to take a moment to just sort of acknowledge the fact that I think oftentimes in design, we don't really fully give full respect that's required to these loyalties and values and losses. We understand them in our head, but we don't necessarily practice them in empathy back to the people that we're dealing with. So when I started the conversation, design is really about creating the container of change, right? It's saying, this is what needs to change. And as designers, we get really, really excited because we get excited about change. Like, it's probably the one profession that loves to live in this space of ambiguity. And we thrive in a space of ambiguity. But the majority of the world around us does not thrive in that space of ambiguity. And I know that a lot of times designers can then get really frustrated when the other people around them are not seeing the vision, like they're not quick to get on board. And that's when that tension point really takes hold, and it can basically be the thing that crashes down, and why design sort of gets, nobody understands me, and this is so bad, and woe is me, and all that type of stuff. So what I would really encourage all those people in the room who are coming from that design perspective is to really pay attention to what is said in this next section here, because unlike designers who are designing the content for change, the people who are working in adaptive leadership are looking at how do we navigate people through that change. And so in some cases that means that the pace may not happen the way that we want to, or as quick or as fast as it could happen. But it will happen with the right empathy being paid to all the different players of that stakeholder map. So with that, I want to turn it to Marco, because Marco has a really interesting background. He has basically lived his life with one foot in academia and one foot in the corporate world. As he would say, I hope I'm not speaking out of turn, in some cases it's an identity crisis of where do I belong, right? But Marco is kind of known as like the carbon footprint guy, and he's really supported organizations, and most recently, prior to joining his newest company, really had some major impact at Miller Courts, and really upset kind of the standard the standard or the status quo, if you will, in terms of how to fund these really big impact goals. So can you talk to us about that a little bit?
Absolutely. So usually companies or corporations tend to think about themselves as those with enough budget to commission work out, to commission research, to commission things, to provide and bring expertise that is not really in-house. So I came, as Brianna mentioned, from academia, and part of that training on research also includes kind of this grant writing ability, or at least the beginning of that, for you to hone and refine over time. So when we got our annual goals, one of my extended teams was in agronomy, all things ingredients for the different products. And the company at that time already understood that the biggest opportunity in water was in agriculture, not in the facilities. 90% of the water footprint of the company globally and domestically is it's contained in the embedded water footprint. So we took that notion and we started engaging with the community of farmers. We're talking about almost 1,000 families across the United States that have been in business with the company for almost 70 years, each one, on an annual basis. So you are having an already ecosystem of society, community, relationships for a number of decades, and then you bring a number of, let's say, technologies, elements, opportunities to further improve what they are already doing very well. So when you're trying to address that particular or navigate that particular complexity, on one side is just the need and the ability for the community to recognize that there is an opportunity to do much better. That doesn't mean that they have done a poor job by any means, historically speaking. So addressing the community with respect, providing the right time to, let's say, change into what they now call digital agriculture, just changing your regular logs and records into digital files. That could easily take 3-4 years because you walk with them into that transition. But when it comes time to implement all these projects, then the company realized very fast that we didn't have the coverage. Ideally, you would like to have one agronomist for one of these 1,000 families. Unfortunately, there is not necessarily any corporation willing or able to have 8,000 agronomists on payroll to provide that 100% coverage. So how do you fill that gap? So initially we thought about the extensions of the local universities. University of Idaho, University of Montana, where they are the places where all the ingredients come from. But then we said, what about the federal government? And people say, no, we are a corporation. We don't talk to the federal government. We shouldn't talk to the federal government. And I said, well, let me tell you, as we have a number of goals, but our stretch goals that will unlock the opportunity for the next 5 years of the company need additional resources that we don't have right now. And we don't have the luxury to wait one more fiscal year. So what happened is that I encouraged both that team, the agronomy team, and part of the sustainability team to write a federal grant to the Department of Agriculture. Of course, that alone sounds massive. It is complex, it is very energy intensive, labor intensive, and of course we didn't get it right the first time. So we tried the first year, we failed, we learned the lesson, and then we tried for a second year. The second year we got it, and the result was a multi-million-dollar federal grant for the communities willing to change their practices, willing to explore new opportunities in the agricultural space for the benefit of not only the community, but the organization at last. Finally, the comment, and this is just a reality, all these companies operate with the framework or the guidance of these United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. In particular, goal number 6 talks about water and the water availability, and therefore agriculture embedded into that. So as we know, what we know right now as the corn belt and all the ingredient belts are shifting very rapidly, more faster than we anticipated. We thought we had 20 years, 25 years to work on this problem. We don't. We have 7 years and a half to resolve this. So part of this multi-year grant has to do with how do we transfer in the future, in the next 7.5 years, all the infrastructure up into Canada when parts of Russia become now arable and productive and they essentially unfreeze from their current state. That's the planning that these global organizations are having. So what I invite you to think about is that collective action happens at different levels. You can pick and choose what are the goals, what are those collective aspirations, but the ability to find resources, financial expertise, or in-kind is almost unlimited. It's just to be willing to look into that aspect. At the end of the day, when the company won the proposal. Many universities, rightfully so, and many foundations say, hey guys, you shouldn't be applying. You are a corporation, you have money to operate. And we said, well, honestly, there is no rule that prohibits any company to write a grant. Honestly, it's because corporations, they are so lazy to undertake that amount of work, that only, for the most part, academics and researchers are trained and they do it very well. So the invitation is that think about other kind of that old notion of the white space where you can actually go and incorporate, bring that expertise, and perhaps devise a new solution that was not there before.
That's excellent. Thank you, Marco. And I know I want to come back to Sharon because she is on the other side of granting these grants, right? And so, Sharon, you have shared with me that there's been many different times in your history where you've changed the rules of the game, if you will. And you're changing the rules of the game around your current granting structure, as you already shared. So how do you help people to navigate this change?
My first reaction to that is, I don't know.
Trial and error, right?
I kind of want to share a story,
Sure.
a different story, to go back to your original point of how you opened this part of the section about, this is something that I learned about kind of designer bias, maybe is what I call it.
Yeah.
But maybe almost 2 years ago, we started work with the designer to think about how to redesign our grant making. And it was kind of not an awesome process. In the end, it was a great process. We got a lot of great ideas, and we ended up with a really great process to engage grantees and partners. But I didn't realize this bias probably was at play, in that there was a dynamic between our consultant and our previous executive director, where both had, I would just say, lots of ego to say, we know best, right? And if you just follow what I'm saying that you guys must do, it will turn out fine. And our previous ED saying the exact same thing, no, you don't understand me. I'm trying to tell you about me and our organization and our ecosystem of grantees. And it almost went south. So I didn't realize that was what was at play. And I ended up being kind of the negotiator to figure out how to not do that. But so there was a huge piece of not listening. And I think I would say, this is a question that I've asked probably over my career of thinking about structural barriers. And so really, the way I've dealt with that in the past is kind of simple. I would just change jobs. Right? I started off in the for-profit sector. I moved to the nonprofit sector. Within the nonprofit sector, I moved from service delivery to policy advocacy to philanthropy. And in philanthropy is where I've seen the best, most tangible opportunity to kind of incent good behavior. So one, I do think that one of the ways in which you can kind of mobilize people and change or get them is dollars and how you structure them can actually incent really good behavior and good positive change. And so much of what we're talking about is that, and the change of how people work and how they engage others. And then I think over the years in the philanthropy sector, a lot of what I've done personally in order to do that is just model. It's just to figure out how to model the change that I want to see, whether it was internal and from internal to external. I worked at a different foundation, and at that foundation, we just funded direct services. So we were really keeping problems persistently in place, right? It was clear that we probably should work a different way, and so I just started bringing my other colleagues together. We took probably 2 or 3 years to learn together about what does it mean to have a really good, healthy workforce development system. How do we begin to have shared values and shared notions around that? That allowed the opportunity and space within our institution to begin to co-fund projects in ways that we never did, and that our board intellectually got, but they didn't really want to do that. That led to me leading the development, the creation of like a much bigger funder collaborative where it was 13 funders that came together to coordinate their resources together to figure out ways to get those dollars to fund like innovative projects that like the workforce development system wouldn't or couldn't do. So it was just modeling behavior and taking a really incremental approach to seeing, and a lot of process and good structured process by which we did that. And then today, like within the foundation, I don't know whether I'm doing a good job of motivating people yet or not. I know that like the work of trying to reframe and redesign organizational culture is super hard. And so I think this is kind of what Randy is saying. And so one, I'm just committed to doing it. I do think that modeling like what that commitment is and providing and structuring resources around that has motivated my team to actually respond to that and to think about very seriously the values that we are making explicit and figuring out how they're living and doing that, giving them supports like getting their own leadership coaching so that they can be different kinds of leaders. So it is really figuring out how to structure the right kinds of support so that we could change our own internal conditions that help us better realize when we're supporting that outside. So that's not kind of a totally technical answer around like, how do I do that? But a lot of it is really kind of being able to visualize what it is that I want to see. So I think the designer world might say, you see things before others can see them. I do think that that's been my personal experience in many ways, and so then it's just figuring out how to map that process, getting supports, and really like staying the course, because so much of this work is long-term and structural, right?
Yeah. Well, thank you. And I think what you're putting voice to is what we talked about before, in the sense that you've set the parameters for what success looks like, and now you're empowering your people to step into that. And I think a couple other things kind of came up from the conversation for me, as far as like what allows you to really support people to go through this unsettling time or sort of navigate the unsettling feelings. And one is like just sort of giving up ego, right? Like you're not, no matter who we are, the smartest person in the room, and being willing to hear and really connect to another point of view, even if you don't share it. And then the other aspect is your willingness to make the ask for support and help, because I think that's another place that sometimes people, struggle to step into. So I want to now take a little bit of a pivot here, because we've been talking about adaptive leadership. And the reality is adaptive leadership and design coming together are an incredibly powerful force. And I really want to ask Sarah to share her experience here, because the Calumet Collaborative had been working in this adaptive leadership space for many years with success, but not the level of impact that they were trying to really motivate. And so, if you go back to design being the container, sort of the content of the change, but adaptive leadership being how to navigate that change, Sarah has had quite a few opportunities to leverage design in this capacity. So Sarah, can you tell us what brought you to using design in this capacity, and then just, some of your experiences to date associated with that?
Sure. So the Calumet Collaborative works in the Calumet region, and the Calumet region is an area that geography that we consider the south side of Chicago, South Cook County, and the 3 counties of northwest Indiana. And over a number of different economic downturns and disinvestment and legacy contamination, there's a significant amount of challenges. But at the same time, there's a significant amount of opportunities and tremendous assets in the region. So while we set out to create this organization, which is almost a form of adaptive leadership, through a collaborative model with 39 different member organizations as primary stakeholders, where we all chime in and determine what we work on together, we also know that this is not a short-term project. This is not we're going to have success immediately in a year. This is a 10 to 20 to 40 year endeavor that we're on. And so the other aspect of that, knowing that this has been a community and a region that has had decades of disinvestment and overlooking and environmental justice issues and inequitable distribution of capacity and funding, let's see here, how do I say this? We knew we had to think differently. How do we think differently about this approach to redeveloping the region, and how do we do it sustainably? And by doing it sustainably, we also want to encourage innovation. We want to encourage new technologies. And so that led us to working with ID. And we had a conversation with a number of faculty from IIT, and part of that conversation was a representative from ID, which was Andre. And I kind of laid out the situation for the Calumet region and what our group was hoping to do. And that sparked a number of conversations between Andre and I, and then Andre and Carlos and Westlyn and I. And then from there, really taking one of our initiatives, which is brownfield redevelopment, which you can probably throw a stone and hit a brownfield in the Calumet region, which we define as underutilized property that may or may not have contamination and need remediation. So we went along that route to just kind of break out of the box of this linear path that typically is taken to redevelop or remediate brownfields, which is phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, which is actually the remediation process, and then it's ready for development. So it's a really long process, but how do we think about it differently to engage different partners? And that's sort of the approach that we had taken, not only with designing the organization the way we did, but also looking to the design community to help us think differently about potential solutions for the region.
Well, and I want to ask you a follow-up question connected to purpose. So one of the things when I was speaking with Sarah initially, like, you know, considering that there's a whole federation of people that she mobilizes to get work done, I had made the ill assumption that they were prioritizing their projects based on impact, and she corrected me and said, no, that's not how we define what projects we go after. We go after projects based on shared purpose. And I think that that's also something that design can really help to focus in on. So can you talk from that perspective around maybe how the interjection of design has really helped to support that purpose?
Yeah, I think, well, just the beginning design of creating a bi-state regional collaboration is like the first aspect of it. And what is it that unites us rather than divides us? So how do, the Calumet region sometimes has a negative perception from the outside of the region, but it also has a negative perception inside the region. But inside that region, as much of a negative perception they also have tremendous pride. And there's so many organizations that that do really great work, that have tremendous pride in their work and tremendous grit and perseverance to continue to do this work. So bringing all of those people together that have this desire, that have this passion to come around a table to then sort out what is it that we can make an impact on, that we all agree on, and it's that sense of purpose rather than the impact. Like I said, the impact is our incremental. We're not sure when we're going to see this big transformational change, but we're going to continue to take the next right step to achieve that change.
That's wonderful. We've got about 6 minutes, 7 minutes here. So I just want to kind of wrap it up, but then ask for one last bit of feedback from everyone. So, you know, I think one thing that we can take away, I loved what you just said around looking for what unites us versus what separates us. And I think one aspect that is, whenever you're doing any kind of transformational work, I think there's the desire to take leaps. But the reality is oftentimes it happens in baby steps. But I always like to say that baby steps and accumulation are leaps, right? So it's a matter of staying the course in looking at what does staying the course look like every day on a daily basis. So what I would like everybody to go down, and maybe we can start with you this time, Randy, and just kind of go down the line, is, if there's people in the room, which I believe almost everybody in the room is definitely intrigued with this concept of, how do you help people to navigate change? And how do you actually inspire and evoke change? And so from your position and your experiences, what would be the one piece of advice that you would offer to people?
I think you were hitting on it at the end there, is to inspire a collective purpose. Because at the end of the day, if you're going to engage in a difficult adaptive work and have to renegotiate some loyalties, question some underlying assumptions or values that you hold very dear to yourself, that you personally hold, or your organization personally holds, your culture personally holds. If you're going to take and experience those losses that are inevitable if you're going to move forward and do adaptive work and create a different future than exists currently, the only reason that you're going to take that risk is that you care about something else a little bit more. And that at the end, all trails, I guess is something I've learned in leadership, end at some competing value choice that you have to make. You really don't know what you care about until you come up against two things you care deeply about and you have to choose. And so this collective purpose is so important because that's really the only thing that really makes us take that step and renegotiate that relationship with failure that we may have to do as we step into the unknown to create something different. So inspiring a collective purpose.
That's wonderful. Thank you.
I would say be the change that you want to see. Don't just talk about it. I know so much of the work is process-oriented and process-driven, and the process is as important as the outcome, but then just do it, right? And I think that in itself is inspiring. It breeds trust. I've been hearing a lot today about designers as being, you guys being neutral kind of arbiters. And I think there's actually a lot of things that you can bring that aren't necessarily about neutral, but that are around values, around how the work gets done, and that make that explicit, and that also helps others really be the change that we want to see.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Sharon. Marco?
One of the tools that has always supported me and served me well is to be a very proactive listener. I think more and more the change management and all the soft skills, if you will, that, I don't know really why they call them soft, because they tend to be the most important ones in practice, is that you could potentially have all the technical and academic training and professional elements on your side, but if you don't really take the time to be empathic, then you don't really take the time to get to know that community, to get to really listen all these different voices of the different stakeholders in a diverse, in an inclusive way, then the ability to formulate, to reevaluate, to really challenge those assumptions is going to be very limited. So always, seek, as the highly effective people always say, you seek first to understand before you are being understood. And I think that will be a great guideline to navigate and be comfortable to higher degrees of uncertainty.
Wonderful.
I would say look for those connections. Get out from behind your computer, sit down with someone, have a conversation. You'll find you have so many more similarities, and that you can find where that tension is, where that desire is, and really find really great partners to work with. If you neglect that piece and it's all through email or even voicemail, you really miss out on developing the nature of a relationship that will last much longer and succeed through failures and through bumps in the road. And you'll create a stronger connection through shared vulnerability and having the conversations about tough things and fun things and work plans and whatnot. So,
excellent. And if I could just sort of put it into one succinct statement, be human, right? Like, from a design perspective, we are always around advocating for the people who are at the center of our systems. I mean, I would say adaptive leadership probably certainly adheres to the same principles. But there can be an opportunity to look at that with an arm's length away from an external point of view, but in process, turning it inward to say, am I being human in this situation as well? Am I purposely looking to connect with others? Am I listening to understand their perspective before I'm putting my 2 cents or perspective within that? And then, looking at what is the shared purpose between us all? What are we all here to do, collectively at an, spiritual, universal level, at an organizational level, at a personal level? And then how do I be the change and be that inspiration that I'm inspiring, hoping for others? So I hope that with this panel discussion, we've got 8 seconds left, so no opportunities for questions. However, I think we will all be here for, after this concludes and can ask them otherwise. But I appreciate everyone's attention and hope that you've learned something around how to help others navigate the change that we all want to be.
Thank you very much, the whole panel and the discussions. Really appreciate the conversation. I think we can try one question. I think it's important that we have some kind of interaction, so I can be quick on my final remarks and save more time for questions. So, anyone, a question for the panel? And do a question trying to connect several dots, Dennis?
Thank you for the panel, and I liked how you summarized the 2 parts of adaptive leadership. There's a third part, though, which actually is equally important, and that is for the leader actually to identify what is the adaptive challenge, because very often that's the most difficult part, and that's where you need to provide guidance to your colleagues and organizations. So I was just wondering from the panel, how have you been able to identify what is really the adaptive challenge? Because it's not the new technology. It has to do with loss of values or power or loss of jobs. So how do you do in your organization? Have you been in your training course, for example? How do you go through that exercise to identify that? Because that's, for me, was the hardest part. So.
Yeah, that's a key point, that one of the biggest reasons for leadership failure is either not diagnosing or misdiagnosing the issue. So in the academy, we actually teach a diagnostic process. We put them in peer consultation groups of 6 people, and each person does a consultation. They bring a challenge that they're facing. And then what we teach in the training is diagnostic skills. So first, how to make observations about what's happening, and then, okay, how do you make interpretations? Not benign, the usual type interpretations, but more adaptive, conflictual, and systemic interpretations of what's happening. In other words, oh, that's just the way Sally is. No. Sally's a product, or Jim is a product of the system, and the system's creating that. So creating this capacity to diagnose a situation, and we actually give them, we put them in a structured process where they're among their peers. The person would have 10 minutes to articulate what the challenges they're facing. The group would then ask follow-up questions to get more data about what it is they're facing. Then the person actually checks out, the person doing the presentation, and the group actually diagnoses the situation without them in the conversation, trying to figure out what values, loyalties, and losses are at stake. What is this person bringing to this problem? What factions are involved, and what's at stake for them, and where's the pushback coming from here? And then then it comes back with a person where they actually present some potential intervention options for the person to consider, and then debriefing with the person about, okay, how did you experience that? With the idea is to help everyone see situations differently, to see different aspects of a situation, and then consider different behavior options, leadership behavior options to intervene in those situations. So spot on diagnosis is a huge part of it, and we spend a lot of time at the Academy exercising that skill.
That's great.
It's not necessarily diagnosing, but prioritizing the adaptive challenges in our organization. Since doing the adaptive leadership training, I can recognize them almost everywhere. And it's really prioritizing and identifying through those adaptive challenges all the projects that we could take on in the region if we had the staff and capacity to do so. But really, for our organization, it's prioritization. So the first adaptive challenge that we took on is how do we get Indiana and Illinois partners to engage with each other, and finding that shared sense of purpose, finding out what those loyalty losses and whatnot are, and then working to have individual conversations and bringing each of those partners to a place of better understanding. There's, of course, where our organization is mostly agencies, organizations, a big adaptive challenge that we're trying to tackle right now is how do we engage the 1.5 million residents that live in the Calumet region? How do we get them involved in the process of transforming the region? And that's a much larger adaptive challenge that we're taking on and really trying to potentially pick apart what might work and how a project might look, and how do we pilot it first, and then do we scale it, and how many people are involved, and whatnot, and will those assumptions actually be effective or accurate enough to be able to then scale, and or because of the diverse geographies, or is there a different solution that needs to be created for each of the geographies? So that's how I've been approaching.
That's great.
There are at least a couple of initial point of arrivals, and one of them is unfortunately very reactive. Most of organizations tend to identify or confirm potential risks because of that, because they either entail a risk on a physical, on a qualitative aspect, on a reputational basis, and then when they try to further figure out exactly the root cause of that risk and then the potential financial implications of those risks, short, medium, long term, is when they change their priorities. Now, we have maybe heard about these materiality indexes or materiality maps that companies, they kind of formally engage with community stakeholders, and they eventually publish this kind of landscape of different stakeholders. Well, companies also prioritize those stakeholders. So I think, just to keep everybody honest in that conversation, business never go off the financial and economic dimension. So for them, what the materiality index tells us is just from all the competing priorities, which ones a particular value chain or organization has explicitly chosen to pursue and put resources and knowledge and energy behind it. Fortunately, most of the time there is a lot of significant overlap with several stakeholders, but I think that it would be naive to think that, well, these companies are doing the water goal or pursuing the zero, value chain for peace because of the good of their hearts. There is not. There is a real business case behind everything. So I think that even though it starts from a reactive space, both the materiality exercise per se allows you to get a general idea of the opportunities and the risk, but most importantly in the short, medium, and long term, because at the end, companies are right now trying to go beyond what they call business continuity. They really, and I think part of that sustainability conversation is not only how we do this fiscal year 18 months from now, no, it's how we do 10, 15, 20 years down the road, even if that means having significantly more assumptions and dealing with higher degrees of uncertainty. Mm-hmm. So that's always a trade-off. More uncertainty, the longer you are trying to look ahead.
That's great.
I would say my answer is not as eloquent as theirs, but it does come from a very human place, which was we had pain points in crisis, and it was all completely outside of our control. So we didn't have a choice but to adapt, and the decision, part of the decision that was in front of us was like, what kind of support do we need to figure out how to prioritize in a way that would, one, get us out of crisis, two, stabilize, and three, get us to get back on the path of the change that we had already started, just by the fact that I was in a new role that had shifted. So it was really like we had huge pain points at the staff level, at the board level, and I didn't know what I was doing, and that was painful in and of itself. So we just got help to figure it out and to prioritize.
One thing that just kind of struck me, and sort of being new to this adaptive leadership things myself, just hearing all of your perspectives, thought about, you could almost kind of put it into a framework of the Eisenhower decision matrix of like important, not important, urgent, not urgent. And my thought is that depending upon where you are and from a timeline of urgency, of an importance, that how you would approach this, you would still be able to fuel the change, but how you would approach that change would differ depending upon which of those. Is that true? Is that fair to say?
That's my summary. That's certainly true in our case.
Because you were like important, urgent, right? You're saying, it was important, not necessarily perceived as so urgent yet from the organization as a whole, and so the strategies to execute would be differently in there. So just an interesting dynamic to consider, I suppose. Well, with that, I will turn it back to you, Carlos. You can close us out